Hi, I'm Rebecca. Last Thanksgiving, my sister Natasha called my pregnancy pathetic and said I was ruining the family bloodline during dinner while our entire extended family sat in stunned silence. Nobody defended me, nobody spoke up. They all just stared, like watching someone humiliate a pregnant woman was perfectly acceptable family entertainment. But my husband, Commander James Mitchell, a decorated naval officer, slowly placed his fork down and stood up from his chair. And what happened next didn't just change our Thanksgiving. It exposed 23 years of toxic family patterns that had been poisoning my life since childhood. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 days later, I discovered something that made me realize this wasn't just about cruel words at a holiday dinner. It was about a lifetime of being the family scapegoat, while my sister built her entire identity around being the quote, daughter who could do no wrong. Before we dive deeper into this story, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And if family drama during the holidays sounds familiar, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow I'm sharing the follow-up that will absolutely shock you. The Carmichael family Thanksgiving had always been Natasha's stage, and this year's gathering at our parents' sprawling estate in Willowbrook Heights was no different. She'd flown in from Manhattan the night before, arriving with her usual entourage of designer luggage, and an attitude that suggested the rest of us should feel honored by her presence. I stood in the kitchen of my childhood home, my hand unconsciously resting on my barely visible bump, watching my mother Catherine frantically rearrange the dining room to accommodate Natasha's specific seating preferences. The house smelled like sage stuffing and roasted turkey, but underneath those comforting aromas was the familiar tension that came with any gathering involving both Carmichael daughters. My father, Harrison, sat in his leather recliner reading financial reports, practicing his usual strategy of emotional unavailability whenever family dynamics threatened to become complicated. He'd mastered this art of selective attention over the decades, especially when it came to managing the constant competition between his daughters. Natasha had been posting about this Thanksgiving for weeks on her social media platforms, calling it her quote, homecoming, and promising her followers an intimate look at family values and tradition. What she hadn't mentioned was that this was actually the first family gathering since James and I had announced our pregnancy 3 months earlier, or that James had just returned from a 6-month deployment in the Mediterranean, or that we'd driven 4 hours from Naval Station Norfolk, specifically to share our joy with my family during the holiday. None of that mattered when it came to Natasha's carefully curated narrative. James emerged from the guest bathroom where he'd been washing up, looking sharp in his dress whites that he'd worn specifically to honor the significance of the occasion. Even off-duty, he carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from years of commanding respect in high-pressure situations. He caught my eye across the room and gave me one of those gentle smiles that meant everything would be fine, even when my pregnancy hormones were making me feel emotionally vulnerable. The dining room had been transformed into what looked like a magazine spread. Natasha had rearranged our grandmother Rose's antique china to create better visual appeal, moved the family photos to optimize lighting, and even replaced the traditional autumn centerpiece with something more Instagram-worthy that she'd apparently commissioned from a florist in the city. She directed conversations around the table like she was hosting a talk show, which in many ways she was, given her lifestyle blog and social media presence. Catherine bustled around her eldest daughter, adjusting and readjusting every detail to meet Natasha's impossible standards. The turkey that had been cooling to the perfect serving temperature was now being kept warm under heat lamps to maintain its appearance for photos. The side dishes had been rearranged multiple times to create more visual appeal. Even the wine selection had been criticized and partially replaced with bottles that would photograph better against the table setting. I had learned long ago not to comment on these productions. Growing up, I'd made the mistake of questioning the absurdity more than once, only to be met with lectures about supporting family and understanding that some people had higher aspirations than others. The implication was always crystal clear. I was small-minded for not appreciating Natasha's vision, jealous of her success, threatened by her ambition and sophistication. James helped me into my chair, his hand briefly touching my shoulder in a gesture of support that didn't go unnoticed. Our pregnancy had been planned and desperately wanted after years of trying, and we'd been overjoyed when the test finally showed positive. At 12 weeks, I was just starting to show, and the morning sickness had finally begun to subside, leaving me feeling genuinely excited about sharing this milestone with my family. The meal began with Natasha's customary gratitude speech, delivered as much to her phone camera as to the family members sitting around the table. She talked eloquently about family heritage, the importance of maintaining standards, and how blessed she felt to come from a lineage of accomplished, successful people. She managed to speak for nearly 15 minutes without mentioning James's military service, our pregnancy, or anything specific about the actual people who were supposed to be the focus of her gratitude. When she finally finished her performance and put away her phone, the atmosphere shifted slightly. Catherine immediately began serving, making sure Natasha's plate looked perfect before addressing anyone else's needs. Harrison emerged from his mental financial reports long enough to carve the turkey, though he kept glancing at his phone nervously throughout the process. James and I exchanged glances as we tried to navigate the meal while I dealt with my still sensitive pregnancy appetite, and he attempted to make genuine conversation with people who seemed more interested in appearance than authentic connection. The discussion flowed in its predictable pattern, with Natasha dominating most of the conversation by updating everyone on her latest business ventures, upcoming collaborations, and the exciting opportunities that seemed to fall into her lap on a regular basis. Catherine hung on every word, asking detailed questions about follower engagement and brand partnerships, as if she were receiving advanced training in digital entrepreneurship. I tried to contribute when there were natural openings, sharing updates about our life at the naval base, James's recent commendation, and how we were preparing for parenthood. But my stories seemed to evaporate into thin air, acknowledged with polite nods before the conversation inevitably circled back to Natasha's world of influence and achievement. It was like trying to add seasoning to a dish that had already been declared perfect and plated for presentation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. James noticed, of course. He always did. He made a deliberate point of asking me follow-up questions about the things I'd mentioned, drawing me back into conversations that had moved on without me. He shared stories about our life at Naval Station Norfolk, about the tight-knit community of military families we'd grown close to, and how proud he was of how I'd managed everything during his deployment while dealing with early pregnancy symptoms. His efforts were kind and intentional, but they also highlighted how little genuine interest my own family showed in my actual life. The Carmichael family dynamics had been established long before I was old enough to understand them. Natasha, 3 years older, had always been the golden child, the one whose achievements were celebrated, whose opinions mattered, whose dreams received unwavering family support. She'd been valedictorian at Westfield Academy, homecoming queen, accepted to Columbia University with a full scholarship, and had built a successful lifestyle brand by age 28 that generated 6 figures annually. I, on the other hand, had been the steady one, good grades but not exceptional ones, involved in activities but never the star. I'd chosen practical nursing school over prestigious universities, married a military man instead of climbing corporate ladders, and had been content building a life of service rather than seeking spotlight recognition. In the Carmichael family hierarchy, this made me simultaneously reliable and invisible. Catherine had spent my entire childhood comparing me to Natasha in ways that were supposedly motivational but felt consistently diminishing. "Why can't you apply yourself like your sister?" Natasha would never settle for such mediocre results. "Maybe if you tried harder you could achieve something meaningful like Natasha has." The message had always been clear. I was the backup daughter, the safety net, the one who would probably be fine but would never make the family truly proud. Harrison's approach was different, but equally damaging. He simply ignored anything that didn't fit his vision of family success. My nursing degree wasn't worth mentioning at business dinners. James's military service was acknowledged politely but never celebrated. Our stable, loving marriage was treated as nice but unremarkable compared to Natasha's high-profile relationships with successful entrepreneurs and creative professionals. The family had organized itself around managing Natasha's needs and accommodating her increasingly demanding personality. Holiday schedules were arranged around her availability. Family conversations were moderated to avoid topics that might upset her or challenge her worldview. Even my own life milestones had been downplayed when they threatened to overshadow her latest achievement or announcement. James had observed these patterns during our 3-year marriage, but today was the first time he was seeing them in full display during a major family gathering. As a naval commander who'd spent years managing complex team dynamics and identifying leadership problems, he was particularly skilled at recognizing dysfunctional power structures. I could see him taking mental notes as he watched the family interactions unfold. Natasha's lifestyle brand, Elevated Living with Natasha, had started as a college blog about fashion and wellness, but had evolved into a multimedia empire covering everything from career advice to relationship guidance to family planning. She'd built a reputation around the concept of intentional excellence, the idea that successful people made deliberate choices about every aspect of their lives, from the food they ate to the relationships they maintained. Her content consistently featured themes about choosing quality over quantity, surrounding yourself with people who elevated your standards, and refusing to settle for mediocrity in any area of life. She'd written extensively about the importance of curating your social circle, maintaining high expectations for yourself and others, and making difficult decisions about family relationships when they didn't align with your values and goals. The irony wasn't lost on me that someone who preached about authentic living and meaningful relationships had built her entire brand around performing a carefully crafted version of herself for public consumption. But Natasha had always been skilled at compartmentalizing her public persona from her private behavior, especially when it came to family interactions. Catherine and Harrison had become willing participants in this performance, proud to be featured occasionally in Natasha's content as examples of the accomplished family background that had shaped her success. They'd learned to present themselves according to her brand requirements, speaking in sound bites about family values and generational wisdom that bore little resemblance to our actual family dynamic. The pregnancy announcement 3 months earlier had been a perfect example of this dysfunction. James and I had called to share our news with genuine excitement, expecting congratulations and support during what we knew would be a challenging deployment period. Instead, Catherine's first response had been to ask whether we'd considered the timing carefully, given James's military obligations and my career demands. Harrison had immediately started calculating financial implications and suggesting practical considerations we should address. Natasha had listened to the news with polite interest, before changing the subject to her upcoming collaboration with a wellness brand that was launching a new line of prenatal vitamins. Nobody had expressed pure joy about becoming grandparents or aunts. Nobody had asked about our hopes and dreams for our child. The conversation had ended with Catherine suggesting we wait until after the first trimester to make any big announcements, and Natasha advising us to really think through whether we were ready for the lifestyle changes that came with parenthood. It had been my first clear indication that my pregnancy wasn't being received as the blessing James and I considered it to be. James had been furious after that phone call, though he'd controlled his reaction to avoid upsetting me during an already emotional time. "Your family treats the most important news of our lives like an inconvenience," he'd said later that evening. "That's not normal, Rebecca. That's not how people who love you respond to something that makes you happy." But I'd spent a lifetime making excuses for my family's emotional limitations, explaining away their self-centeredness as busy schedules or different communication styles. I'd convinced myself that they cared about me in their own way, even if they weren't demonstrative about it. I'd accepted that Natasha's achievements would always overshadow my life events, and that Catherine and Harrison's attention would always flow toward their more successful daughter. James's military community had provided a stark contrast to my family's response. When we'd shared our pregnancy news at the base, we'd been surrounded by genuine excitement and support. Colonel Patricia Hendricks had immediately started planning a unit baby shower. Lieutenant Sarah Chen had offered to connect me with other military spouses who'd navigated pregnancy during deployments. The entire community had rallied around us with practical help and emotional encouragement. This is how family is supposed to respond, James had observed after a particularly supportive gathering with our naval community. People who care about you celebrate your happiness. They don't make you feel like your joy is an inconvenience or that your choices need their approval. Now, sitting at the Thanksgiving table and watching Natasha hold court while our parents hung on her every word, I was beginning to see the situation through James's eyes. This wasn't just about different personalities or communication styles. This was about a family system that had been organized around one person's needs for so long that everyone else had become supporting characters in her narrative. And today, for the first time in my life, I had someone sitting beside me who recognized the dysfunction and wasn't willing to participate in it. The tension began building during the second course when Natasha started what she called her family wellness check-in. This was apparently a new tradition she'd developed after reading about successful families who used gatherings to discuss goals, aspirations, and personal growth. She'd written about it extensively on her blog, positioning it as a way to maintain high standards and meaningful connections with the people who mattered most. "I think it's important that we use this time together to really connect on a deeper level," she announced, pulling out her phone to take notes. "I've been reading about how the most successful families create accountability systems for each other. We should be helping each other reach our highest potential instead of just accepting mediocrity." Catherine immediately perked up, clearly thrilled to be included in what sounded like one of Natasha's professional development concepts. "What a wonderful idea, sweetheart. You're always thinking of ways to improve everything around you." Harrison nodded approvingly while continuing to cut his turkey with mechanical precision. Efficiency and goal setting, very practical approach. James and I exchanged a glance across the table. There was something in his expression that I'd learned to recognize during his military career. The look he got when assessing a situation that appeared normal on the surface, but had underlying problems that needed careful attention. Natasha began with Catherine, asking detailed questions about her volunteer work with the Willowbrook Heights Garden Club, and suggesting ways she could leverage her organizational skills to take on more leadership responsibilities. She praised Catherine's, quote, natural ability to create beautiful environments, and recommended books about maximizing personal influence in community organizations. Catherine glowed under the attention, clearly feeling validated by her daughter's professional-level interest in her activities. This was exactly the kind of interaction that had always made me feel invisible. Natasha's ability to make people feel special and important when she chose to focus on them. Harrison received similar treatment, with Natasha asking strategic questions about his investment portfolio and suggesting networking opportunities that could enhance his business relationships. She'd apparently researched several potential connections in his field and had specific recommendations about conferences he should attend and partnerships he should consider. "You've always been so good at seeing the big picture, Dad," she said, making notes on her phone. "I think you're not fully capitalizing on your expertise. There are people in my network who could really benefit from your insights, and vice versa." Harrison actually smiled, a rare occurrence during family gatherings, clearly pleased by his daughter's recognition of his business acumen and her offer to facilitate professional connections. This was Natasha at her most charming, generous with specific, actionable advice and genuine appreciation for people's strengths. Then she turned to James, and I felt my stomach tighten, with an anxiety I couldn't quite explain. "James, I'm really curious about your long-term career strategy," she began, her tone friendly but with an undertone I recognized from her more challenging blog posts. Military service is obviously noble and everything, but have you thought about transitioning to something with more growth potential? I mean, government salaries are pretty limiting, especially with a family to support now. James set down his fork carefully, his expression remaining neutral but alert. I find naval command quite fulfilling, both personally and professionally. The leadership opportunities and global impact are significant. Oh, I'm sure it's fulfilling, Natasha continued, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. But fulfillment doesn't pay for college tuitions or build retirement funds. I actually know several former military guys who've made really smart transitions into private sector consulting. The discipline and leadership experience translates well, and the financial upside is substantial. I appreciate the suggestion, James replied evenly. Rebecca and I are comfortable with our current path and financial planning. Something shifted in Natasha's demeanor. The helpful, supportive tone began to take on a sharper edge. I just think it's important to be realistic about your responsibilities now. I mean, bringing a child into the world when you're dependent on government employment and dealing with constant deployments, that's a lot of instability to impose on a family. Catherine looked uncomfortable but didn't intervene. Harrison continued eating as if he hadn't heard the conversation taking a confrontational turn. James's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained controlled. Military families successfully raise children all over the world. Our community provides excellent support systems, and we've planned carefully for this pregnancy. Planning is great, Natasha said, her tone becoming more condescending. But planning based on limited income and unpredictable schedules isn't really setting your family up for success. I mean, Rebecca's nursing salary is nice and all, but it's not exactly going to cover the costs of quality childcare and education. I felt heat rising in my chest as I watched my sister systematically undermine my husband's career and our family's financial security. This wasn't wellness coaching or family accountability. This was deliberate diminishment disguised as helpful concern. Actually, I interjected, my voice less steady than I wanted it to be. We're very proud of James's service, and we're excited about raising our child in the military community. It's provided us with incredible opportunities and relationships. Natasha turned her attention to me with the kind of smile that had always made me feel like I was being assessed and found wanting. Rebecca, I love that you're optimistic, but optimism isn't a financial strategy. And honestly, the timing of this pregnancy is just… She paused, as if searching for the right words. It's not very strategic. What do you mean? I asked, though part of me didn't want to hear her answer. Well, you're 31, James is 33. You've barely established your careers. You have minimal savings. You're dealing with deployment separations. And now you're adding the massive expense and responsibility of a child. It just seems like maybe you should have waited until you were more settled and financially secure. Catherine finally spoke up, but not in my defense. Natasha does have a point about timing, honey. Starting a family is such a big responsibility. Maybe if you'd waited a few more years. The words hit me like a slap. My own mother was agreeing that my pregnancy was poorly timed, that James and I had made an irresponsible decision in trying to start our family. We wanted this baby, I said, my voice becoming stronger despite the hurt. We planned for this pregnancy. We're financially stable and emotionally ready to be parents. Wanting something and being prepared for it are two different things, Natasha replied, her tone taking on the authoritative quality she used in her more serious blog posts. I've done extensive research on family planning and financial readiness. The data is pretty clear about the income levels and stability markers that predict successful parenting outcomes. James had gone completely still, his attention focused entirely on Natasha, with the kind of intensity I'd seen him use when assessing potential threats during military operations. But before he could respond, Natasha continued. I mean, let's be honest about the broader picture here. Rebecca has always struggled with follow-through and realistic goal setting. Remember the art therapy program she started and never finished? The yoga instructor certification she got but never used? The small business ideas that never went anywhere? My face burned with embarrassment as she cataloged my perceived failures in front of my husband and parents. These were private struggles and abandoned projects that I'd shared with family members during vulnerable moments, now being weaponized to support her argument about my inadequacy as a future parent. "I just think someone needs to ask the hard questions here," Natasha concluded, her voice taking on a tone of concerned superiority. "Is this really what's best for the child? Is bringing a baby into this situation actually responsible, or is it just what Rebecca wants regardless of practical considerations?" The silence that followed was deafening. Catherine stared at her plate, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to contradict her favored daughter. Harrison had disappeared back into his phone, practicing his usual strategy of avoiding difficult family moments. And James was watching Natasha with the controlled stillness of a predator evaluating prey, his military training evident in every line of his posture. The air in the dining room had shifted from uncomfortable to genuinely tense, and I realized that whatever happened next would change the trajectory of this gathering completely. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal truths about my family that I'd spent 3 decades avoiding. The moment arrived like a slow-motion car crash that I could see coming but was powerless to prevent. Natasha had been building towards something throughout her interrogation of James and me, and I could feel the weight of her impending judgment settling over the dining room like storm clouds gathering before lightning strikes. She leaned back in her chair with the satisfied expression of someone who had successfully made her point, then delivered what she clearly considered the definitive statement on our situation. "Look, I'm not trying to be cruel here, but someone in this family needs to be willing to speak truth. Rebecca, this whole pregnancy situation is just pathetic." The word hung in the air like a physical presence. Pathetic. She'd called my pregnancy, my desperately wanted, carefully planned, joyfully anticipated baby, pathetic. "It's embarrassing, honestly," she continued, her voice gaining confidence as she warmed to her theme. "You're 31 years old, married to a man with limited career prospects, living paycheck to paycheck on a military base, and now you're bringing a child into that mess because you think a baby is going to magically make your life meaningful." I felt the blood drain from my face as her words hit me with the force of physical blows. This wasn't constructive criticism or tough love. This was calculated cruelty designed to humiliate me in front of the people whose opinions mattered most to me. "Natasha," I whispered, my voice barely audible, "how can you say that?" But she wasn't finished. Having found her target, she pressed forward with the ruthless precision of someone who had been thinking about this attack for weeks. "And the worst part is that you're going to raise this child with the same lack of ambition and realistic planning that's defined your entire adult life. You're perpetuating a cycle of mediocrity, and that's not fair to an innocent child who deserves parents who can actually provide stability and opportunities." Catherine made a small sound of distress, but didn't speak. Harrison's phone had disappeared, but he sat frozen in his chair, clearly paralyzed by the intensity of the confrontation unfolding in front of him. "You're ruining the family bloodline," Natasha declared, her voice rising with dramatic flair. "Generations of Carmichaels who built successful businesses, contributed to their communities, and maintained high standards, and you're going to dilute all of that with your acceptance of mediocrity? It's honestly depressing to watch." The silence that followed was absolute. Not the comfortable quiet of a family enjoying a meal together, but the stunned silence of people witnessing something so shocking that their brains needed time to process what they'd just heard. I sat frozen, one hand unconsciously moving to protect my barely visible bump while tears began to blur my vision. In 31 years of living with Natasha's criticisms and condescension, she had never been this deliberately vicious. She had never attacked something so fundamental to my identity and future happiness. The cruelty was breathtaking in its precision. She'd identified every insecurity I'd ever had about our financial situation, James's military career, my own perceived failures, and my worthiness as a future mother, then weaponized all of it into a comprehensive assault on my pregnancy itself. Catherine's face had gone pale, her mouth opening and closing as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find words adequate to address what her eldest daughter had just said. Harrison looked like he wanted to disappear entirely, his usual strategy of emotional withdrawal completely inadequate for a situation this explosive. But it was James's reaction that would haunt me for years afterward. I watched in real time as my husband's expression shifted from shock to disbelief to something much more dangerous. His training had taught him to remain calm under pressure, to assess threats systematically, and to respond with proportional force when necessary. What Natasha had just done wasn't family disagreement or even ordinary cruelty. It was a deliberate attack on his wife, his unborn child, and everything he'd worked to build with the woman he loved. In military terms, it was an act of aggression that demanded immediate and decisive response. He placed his napkin beside his plate with the careful precision of someone controlling every movement to avoid a larger explosion. His chair scraped against the hardwood floor as he stood, his 6'2" frame suddenly dominating the dining room in a way that made everyone else seem smaller by comparison. "Excuse me," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made people stop talking and pay attention. "Could you repeat what you just said about my wife's pregnancy?" Natasha, who had been riding high on her successful demolition of my emotional state, suddenly seemed to realize that she might have pushed too far. The room's energy had shifted dramatically, and James's controlled stillness was far more intimidating than any display of anger would have been. "I was just being honest about the practical realities," she said, her voice becoming defensive. "Sometimes family members need to hear difficult truths." "The practical realities," James repeated, his tone remaining conversational but with an underlying steel that sent chills down my spine. "Is that what you call telling a pregnant woman that her child is pathetic and that she's ruining her family's bloodline?" "I didn't say the child was pathetic," Natasha backtracked quickly. "I said the situation was pathetic. The timing, the circumstances, the lack of proper planning." "Actually," James said, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out his phone, "let me make sure I understand exactly what was said here." His finger moved across the screen with practiced efficiency. "Because I want to be very precise about this conversation." My heart stopped as I realized what he was doing. James had been recording the dinner conversation, a habit he'd developed during sensitive military briefings, where accurate documentation was essential for later analysis and accountability. "According to my recording," he continued, his voice still deadly calm, "you said, and I quote, 'This whole pregnancy situation is just pathetic. It's embarrassing, honestly. You're ruining the family bloodline.' You also said that my wife was, quote, 'perpetuating a cycle of mediocrity,' and that it was not fair to an innocent child to be born to parents like us." The blood drained from Natasha's face as she realized that her carefully crafted attack had been captured word for word. In an era where public figures could be destroyed by a single poorly chosen sentence, she had just delivered a comprehensive assault on a pregnant family member while being unknowingly recorded by a military officer trained in documentation and evidence gathering. "You were recording our family dinner?" she asked, her voice rising with panic. "I record many conversations," James replied evenly. "It's a professional habit that helps ensure accuracy when discussing important matters. And I consider attacks on my pregnant wife to be very important matters indeed." Catherine finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "James, surely we can discuss this calmly." Natasha didn't mean. "With respect, Mrs. Carmichael," James interrupted, his formal tone making it clear that family politeness was no longer operational. "Your daughter said exactly what she meant to say. She called my wife's pregnancy pathetic, accused her of ruining the family bloodline, and suggested that our child would be better off not being born to parents like us." He turned his attention back to Natasha, who was now looking around the table desperately for support that wasn't coming. I need you to understand something very clearly. You just spent the last 5 minutes systematically attacking my pregnant wife, questioning her worth as a future mother, and suggesting that our planned and wanted child is somehow a mistake that damages your family's reputation. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as James continued speaking. In my professional experience, people who attack pregnant women and unborn children aren't the kind of people who should have access to those children once they're born. So I'm going to ask you a very simple question. Do you stand by what you just said, or would you like to reconsider your position? It was a masterclass in controlled confrontation. James had given Natasha an opportunity to walk back her attack, to apologize and attempt to repair the damage she'd caused. But his tone and posture made it clear that this was her only chance, and that whatever she said next would determine how this situation proceeded. The entire room held its breath, waiting to see whether Natasha would choose wisdom or double down on the cruelty that had already shattered the facade of family harmony forever. Natasha's response revealed everything about her character that I had spent decades trying to rationalize away. Instead of apologizing, instead of recognizing the gravity of what she'd just said to a pregnant woman, she chose to escalate. "Stand by what I said," she repeated, her voice taking on the indignant tone she used when challenged on her blog or social media. "James, you're acting like I committed some terrible crime. I was giving honest feedback about a situation that affects this entire family. Rebecca has always needed people to be direct with her because she doesn't pick up on subtle social cues." The audacity was breathtaking. She was doubling down, reframing her attack as helpful honesty that I was too socially inept to appreciate properly. It was classic Natasha. When confronted with the consequences of her behavior, she positioned herself as the victim of other people's oversensitivity. James's expression didn't change, but something subtle shifted in his posture. As a naval commander, he dealt with subordinates who tried to justify unacceptable behavior, and he'd developed zero tolerance for people who refused to take accountability for their actions. "I see," he said quietly. "So to clarify your position, you believe that calling a pregnant woman's pregnancy pathetic and telling her she's ruining the family bloodline constitutes honest feedback that she should be grateful to receive." "I believe that family members should be able to have honest conversations about important decisions without everyone getting hysterical," Natasha shot back, her confidence returning as she fell back on familiar patterns of manipulation. "Rebecca has always been overly emotional about criticism. It's one of her biggest weaknesses." That was the moment James's military training took over completely. I watched him shift into command mode with the fluid precision of someone who had spent years making life and death decisions under pressure. His voice remained calm, but it carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed immediately and without question. "Mrs. Carmichael, Mr. Carmichael," he said, addressing my parents with formal courtesy that somehow made his words more powerful than shouting would have been. "I need you both to understand what just happened at your dinner table. Your daughter attacked my pregnant wife, called our planned child pathetic, and when given an opportunity to apologize, chose instead to blame Rebecca for being, quote, overly emotional about having her pregnancy described as an embarrassment to the family." Catherine and Harrison both looked like they wanted to sink through the floor. The formal way James was addressing them, using their surnames instead of the casual family names he'd adopted over 3 years of marriage, made it clear that relationships had fundamentally shifted in the past 10 minutes. "Now," James continued, his attention returning to Natasha, "you have a choice to make. You can apologize to my wife for what you just said, acknowledge that attacking a pregnant woman was inappropriate regardless of your personal opinions about our circumstances, and commit to treating her with basic respect going forward." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. "Or you can continue with your current approach, in which case I will ensure that every member of your professional network, every brand partner you work with, and every follower you've built your career on understands exactly how you treat pregnant family members when you think no one is paying attention." The threat was delivered with surgical precision. James understood that Natasha's entire identity and income depended on her carefully curated image as someone who elevated others and promoted positive family values. A recording of her calling her pregnant sister's baby pathetic and accusing her of ruining the family bloodline would destroy everything she'd spent years building. "You're threatening me?" Natasha asked, her voice rising with a combination of panic and outrage. "You're going to try to destroy my career because I hurt Rebecca's feelings?" "I'm offering you accountability," James corrected calmly. "You seem to believe that family relationships exempt you from consequences for your behavior. I'm explaining that they don't. You just spent 10 minutes systematically attacking my pregnant wife, and now you're upset that there might be repercussions for that choice." Harrison finally found his voice, though it came out strained and uncertain. "James, surely we can work this out as a family. These things happen during emotional discussions." James turned to my father with the patient expression he used when explaining basic concepts to people who should already understand them. "Mr. Carmichael, with respect, these things don't just happen. Your daughter made a deliberate choice to attack Rebecca's pregnancy, question her worth as a future mother, and suggest that our child would damage your family's reputation. Those were calculated statements designed to cause maximum emotional harm." He gestured toward the recording device on the table. "And when given an opportunity to apologize, she chose to defend her behavior and blame Rebecca for being too sensitive. That's not an emotional discussion. That's a pattern of deliberate cruelty followed by strategic manipulation." Catherine was crying quietly, tears streaming down her face as she watched 30 years of family dynamics collapse in real time. "Please," she whispered. "We can fix this. We can all sit down and talk through our differences like adults." "Mrs. Carmichael," James said gently, his tone softening slightly when addressing my obviously distressed mother, "I appreciate that you want to maintain family relationships, but your daughter just told my pregnant wife that her baby is pathetic and that she's ruining your family bloodline. There are some things that can't be fixed with conversation and compromise." He stood up slowly, his full height making him an imposing presence in the suddenly smaller-feeling dining room. "Rebecca and I will be leaving now. We came here to share our joy about our pregnancy with people we thought would celebrate with us. Instead, we've been subjected to a systematic attack on our marriage, our financial security, our career choices, and our unborn child." I started to rise from my chair, my legs shaky with adrenaline and emotion, but James was already moving to help me. His hand was steady and warm on my elbow as he guided me to my feet, his other arm positioning itself protectively around my shoulders. "Natasha," he said, his voice returning to the deadly calm that had characterized his earlier statements, "you have until we reach our car to decide whether you want to apologize to my wife. After that, the recording of this conversation will be shared with appropriate parties to ensure that other pregnant women in your professional and personal circles understand how you really feel about family planning and childbearing." The ultimatum was clear and non-negotiable. James had given her multiple opportunities to choose accountability over defensiveness, and she had repeatedly chosen to escalate rather than apologize. Now she had less than 2 minutes to salvage a situation that she had created entirely through her own choices. "You can't do this," Natasha said, but her voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. The reality of potential consequences was finally beginning to penetrate her sense of entitlement to consequence-free cruelty. "I absolutely can," James replied matter-of-factly, "and I absolutely will. You made a choice to attack my pregnant wife. I'm making a choice to ensure there are appropriate consequences for that decision. The only remaining question is whether you want to add a sincere apology to the record, or whether you prefer to let your original statements stand as your final position on this matter." As he guided me toward the front door, I realized that everything had changed in the span of 15 minutes. The family dynamics that had shaped my entire life had been exposed as fundamentally toxic, and my husband had drawn a line in the sand that would reshape every relationship going forward. For the first time in my adult life, someone had stood up for me without requiring me to minimize my own hurt or accommodate someone else's emotional needs. Someone had seen the cruelty I'd been enduring and decided it was unacceptable, regardless of family expectations or social conventions. The war that was about to begin had been brewing for decades. James had simply forced it into the open, where it could no longer hide behind polite smiles and holiday traditions. The phone calls started before we even reached Naval Station Norfolk. My cell buzzed incessantly during the 4-hour drive home, the dashboard display lighting up with "Mom" and "Dad" over and over again. James had suggested I turn it off entirely, but some masochistic part of me needed to see how quickly the family damage control machine would spring into action. By the time we pulled into our driveway, I had 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. James helped me out of the car with the extra care he'd shown since learning about the pregnancy, his protective instincts heightened by the emotional trauma of the afternoon. Our modest base housing felt like a sanctuary after the toxic atmosphere of my childhood home. "Don't read them tonight," James advised as I stared at my phone. "Let yourself process what happened before you let them start rewriting the narrative." But I was already opening the messages, driven by a lifetime of conditioning that made ignoring my family's communications feel impossible. The texts followed a predictable pattern that revealed how quickly they'd coordinated their response strategy. Catherine's messages began with frantic apologies. "Sweetheart, I'm so sorry about dinner. Natasha was under a lot of stress from work. She didn't mean what she said. Please call me so we can fix this." But as the messages continued, they shifted toward manipulation. "You know how much she loves you. She was just worried about your financial situation. Family means forgiving each other's mistakes." Harrison's texts were more strategic, focusing on practical considerations. "Rebecca, let's not let one difficult conversation damage decades of family relationships. These things happen when emotions run high. We should discuss this calmly when everyone has had time to cool down." But it was Natasha's messages that revealed the true scope of her narcissistic worldview. Her first text arrived 30 minutes after we'd left. "I can't believe James threatened me over a family discussion. You need to get your husband under control before he destroys our entire family." The messages escalated from there. "I was trying to help you make better decisions, and this is how you repay me? By letting your husband threaten my career? You've always been jealous of my success, but this is a new low." Then, "Mom and Dad are devastated. You're breaking their hearts over nothing. I hope you're proud of yourself for choosing your husband's ego over your own family." Finally, "Fine. If you want to burn bridges over me giving you honest advice, that's your choice. But don't come crying to me when your perfect military marriage falls apart and you're a single mother struggling to make ends meet." I read the messages aloud to James, my voice becoming steadier with each revelation of my sister's complete lack of self-awareness or accountability. Instead of apologizing for calling my pregnancy pathetic, she was angry that there might be consequences for her behavior. Instead of recognizing the cruelty of her words, she was positioning herself as the victim of James's overreaction. "She genuinely believes she did nothing wrong," I said, staring at the phone in disbelief. "She thinks James threatened her for no reason, and that I'm choosing my husband over my family by not defending her right to attack my pregnancy." James was reading over my shoulder, his expression growing grimmer with each message. "This is textbook manipulation. She's trying to isolate you from support, make you doubt your own perceptions, and position herself as the injured party. It's sophisticated gaslighting." The next morning brought a phone call from Catherine that lasted over an hour and left me feeling like I'd been psychologically battered. My mother had clearly spent the night developing talking points designed to minimize Natasha's behavior and maximize my responsibility for the family crisis. "Honey, I know Natasha's words were hurtful, but you have to understand the context," Catherine began, her voice taking on the patient tone she'd used throughout my childhood when explaining why I needed to be more understanding of my sister's behavior. "She's been under enormous pressure with her business. 3 major brand partnerships fell through last month, and she's been working 18-hour days trying to salvage her quarterly revenue targets." "Mom," I interrupted, She called my pregnancy pathetic and said I was ruining the family bloodline. Stress doesn't excuse that level of cruelty. But that's exactly my point, sweetheart. She was stressed and overwhelmed, and maybe her words came out harsher than she intended. You know how much she loves you. She's always been protective of you, sometimes to a fault. The revisionist history was breathtaking in its audacity. Natasha's systematic attack on my pregnancy, my marriage, and my worth as a future mother was being reframed as protective concern expressed poorly due to work stress. She wasn't being protective, Mom. She was being deliberately cruel. There's a difference between concern and attack. I think you're reading malice into what was really just poor communication, Catherine continued, her voice becoming more insistent. Natasha has always been direct. That's part of what's made her so successful in business. Sometimes that directness can feel harsh to people who are more sensitive. There it was, the familiar refrain that had shaped my entire childhood. I was too sensitive to appreciate Natasha's directness. My hurt feelings were evidence of my own emotional weakness rather than legitimate responses to genuinely harmful behavior. And honestly, Catherine continued, James's reaction was completely disproportionate. Threatening to damage her career over a family disagreement? That's not how married couples handle conflicts with in-laws. It shows a concerning lack of respect for family relationships. The conversation continued in this vein for another 40 minutes, with Catherine systematically undermining every aspect of my perspective on what had happened. According to her narrative, Natasha had expressed legitimate concerns about our financial readiness in an unfortunately blunt manner. I had overreacted due to pregnancy hormones and sensitivity. James had escalated a minor family disagreement into a major crisis through his inability to understand how families communicate. By the time I hung up, I felt disoriented and confused about my own memories of the previous day. Had I misunderstood Natasha's intent? Was James's response really disproportionate? Were pregnancy hormones making me interpret normal family dynamics as something more sinister? Harrison's call that afternoon took a different approach but achieved the same result. Instead of emotional manipulation, he focused on practical consequences and family loyalty obligations. Rebecca, I understand you were hurt by what Natasha said, but we need to think about the bigger picture here, he began in his businessman voice. This family has been together for over 30 years. We've weathered disagreements before, and we've always found ways to work through our differences. Dad, this wasn't a disagreement. This was an attack on my pregnancy and my worth as a future mother. I hear that you experienced it that way, he replied with the diplomatic language he used in difficult business negotiations. But perhaps there's room for multiple interpretations of what happened. Natasha sees herself as having expressed concerns about timing and financial planning. You experienced those concerns as personal attacks. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. The false equivalency was maddening. Harrison was suggesting that Natasha's deliberate cruelty and my hurt response to that cruelty were equally valid perspectives that needed to be balanced through compromise and understanding. What would a resolution look like to you? I asked, genuinely curious about what he thought would constitute an acceptable outcome. I think Natasha should acknowledge that her communication style was unnecessarily harsh, he said carefully. And I think you and James should recognize that her underlying concerns about financial planning and career stability weren't entirely without merit. Everyone takes partial responsibility, everyone learns from the experience, and we move forward as a family. What about accountability for calling my pregnancy pathetic and saying I was ruining the family bloodline? Well, those were unfortunate word choices, Harrison admitted, but I think focusing on specific phrases rather than overall intent isn't productive. The important thing is that we don't let one difficult conversation destroy relationships that have been decades in the making. After Harrison's call, I sat in our small living room feeling like I was losing my grip on reality. 3 people I'd trusted my entire life were telling me that my interpretation of yesterday's events was wrong, that my emotional response was disproportionate, and that my husband's protective reaction was the real problem that needed addressing. James found me there when he returned from base, staring at the wall with the blank expression he'd learned to recognize as emotional overwhelm. He sat beside me on our second-hand couch and waited patiently for me to process whatever internal storm was raging. "They're making me feel crazy," I finally said. "According to my family, Natasha was just expressing legitimate concerns in a blunt way. I'm overreacting due to pregnancy hormones, and you're the real problem for threatening consequences." "They've completely rewritten what happened yesterday." James nodded grimly. "That's exactly what I expected them to do. People who enable abuse have to rewrite reality in order to continue enabling it. If they acknowledged what really happened, they'd have to take action they're not willing to take. But what if they're right? What if I am being too sensitive? What if pregnancy hormones are making me interpret normal family communication as something worse than it really is?" James pulled out his phone and opened the recording app. "Would you like to listen to exactly what your sister said yesterday? Not their interpretation of it, not their explanation of her intent, but her actual words?" I nodded, needing to ground myself in objective reality, rather than the competing narratives that were making me doubt my own memory and judgment. As Natasha's voice filled our living room, calling my pregnancy pathetic and embarrassing, describing our child as a perpetuation of mediocrity, and declaring that I was ruining the family bloodline, the clarity returned with devastating force. There was no ambiguity in her tone, no room for misinterpretation about her intent. She had been deliberately, systematically cruel, and the recording proved it beyond any reasonable doubt. The gaslighting campaign had nearly worked, but the truth was preserved in digital format, immune to revision and reinterpretation. The revelation that my family had been systematically gaslighting me for decades hit like a physical blow. Listening to the recording had crystallized something that had been building in my subconscious for years. This wasn't the first time they'd rewritten reality to protect Natasha and minimize my legitimate concerns. I spent the next 3 days methodically going through old text messages, emails, and journal entries, looking for patterns I'd previously dismissed as normal family dynamics. What I discovered was a comprehensive system of reality distortion that had been operating since childhood. There was the incident from 2 years ago when Natasha had borrowed my grandmother Rose's pearl necklace, a family heirloom that had been promised to me, and then claimed she'd been given permission by Catherine to take it permanently. When I'd objected, the family narrative became that I was being materialistic, and that grandmother Rose would have wanted the necklace to go to whichever granddaughter would appreciate and showcase it properly. I found emails from that time where Catherine had written, "Rebecca, you know Natasha has always had a special connection to beautiful things. Grandmother Rose used to say that some people have an eye for elegance, and others are more practical. The necklace looks so lovely on Natasha, and she wears it to important events where it gets noticed and admired." The message was clear. Natasha deserved beautiful things because she was beautiful and sophisticated enough to display them properly. I was too practical and ordinary to warrant such treasures. My attachment to a family heirloom that had been specifically promised to me was reframed as jealousy of my sister's superior aesthetic sense. I discovered a pattern of birthday and Christmas celebrations where my achievements had been consistently minimized to avoid overshadowing Natasha's announcements. When I had graduated nursing school summa cum laude, the family dinner conversation had been dominated by Natasha's new brand partnership with a wellness company. When James and I had gotten engaged, Catherine had spent most of the celebratory dinner discussing Natasha's upcoming feature in a lifestyle magazine. In each case, I'd been told that I was being selfish for wanting attention on my special occasions, that successful families celebrate each other's achievements rather than competing for spotlight, and that my need for recognition showed a concerning level of insecurity and attention-seeking behavior. The documentation revealed something even more disturbing. A consistent pattern of my family sharing my private information with Natasha so she could use it against me in future conflicts. Personal struggles I'd confided to my parents, my miscarriage 2 years before this pregnancy, James's difficult adjustment after his last deployment, our financial stress during his military training period, had all somehow become ammunition in Natasha's arsenal of criticisms about my life choices. James watched me compile this evidence with the grim recognition of someone who'd seen similar intelligence patterns during military investigations. "It's systematic," he observed, reviewing my timeline of incidents. "They've been conditioning you for decades to doubt your own perceptions and accept their version of reality, no matter how it contradicts your actual experience." "Why would they do this?" I asked, staring at years of documented emotional manipulation. "Why would my own parents participate in making me feel crazy?" "Because managing your reactions is easier than managing Natasha's behavior," James replied. "You're reasonable and empathetic, so you can be convinced to doubt yourself and make accommodations. Natasha is volatile and vindictive, so they've learned to avoid confronting her by redirecting responsibility onto the people she hurts." The psychological framework was becoming clear. My family had spent decades training me to be the designated problem solver and peacekeeper, the person who absorbed emotional damage and made endless accommodations to maintain the illusion of family harmony. Meanwhile, Natasha had been trained to expect consequence-free behavior and unlimited family support for whatever she chose to do. I called my cousin Amanda, Catherine's niece, who had grown up attending the same family gatherings and might have observed these dynamics from an outside perspective. Amanda lived in Chicago and had maintained some distance from the family drama over the years, but she'd always been honest about what she witnessed during our childhood. "Rebecca," she said when I explained what had happened at Thanksgiving, "I've been waiting for someone to finally call out this insanity for 20 years. What Natasha said to you was horrible, but it's not even close to the worst thing I've seen her do to family members." Amanda's perspective was revelatory. As someone who'd been present but not central to family dynamics, she'd observed patterns that I'd been too close to recognize clearly. "Do you remember when you were about 12 and you'd spent months planning that science fair project about marine biology?" Amanda asked. "You were so excited about it, and you'd been talking about wanting to study ocean conservation since you were little." I remembered the project vaguely, something about coral reef ecosystems that I'd worked on for weeks with passionate dedication. "The day before the science fair, Natasha convinced your parents that your project was too advanced for a 12-year-old and that you must have gotten inappropriate help from adults," Amanda continued. "She said it would be embarrassing for the family if you presented work that was obviously beyond your capabilities and got caught cheating." The memory came flooding back with painful clarity. I had been devastated when my parents had forbidden me from participating in the science fair, telling me that my project was too sophisticated and that I needed to learn to work within my actual skill level, rather than trying to impress people with borrowed knowledge. "But I did all that research myself," I told Amanda, the 12-year-old's hurt still fresh in my voice. "I spent weeks in the library reading about coral reef systems and ocean chemistry." "I know you did," Amanda said gently. "I was there when you were explaining the project to me with such enthusiasm and detailed knowledge. You clearly understood every aspect of what you'd researched." But Natasha had been working on some art project for the same science fair, and your marine biology research was getting more attention from the family than her painting. So she sabotaged my participation? She convinced your parents that protecting you from potential embarrassment was more important than letting you present your work. And somehow they believed that a 12-year-old couldn't possibly have learned about ocean conservation through legitimate research. Amanda had more examples, each one revealing how Natasha had systematically undermined my achievements and interests throughout our childhood while my parents enabled and participated in the sabotage. When I'd wanted to take advanced art classes in high school, Natasha had convinced Catherine that I was trying to copy her artistic interests and that it would be unhealthy for me to compete in areas where I couldn't match her natural talents. When I'd been accepted to several excellent nursing programs, Harrison had been coached to emphasize the financial costs and question whether I was really committed enough to justify the investment. Your parents aren't evil people, Amanda explained, but they've been completely manipulated by Natasha's version of family dynamics. She's convinced them that protecting her from competition and supporting her ambitions is the same thing as loving their children equally. The conversation with Amanda provided crucial external validation for patterns I'd sensed but never been able to articulate clearly. I wasn't imagining the favoritism, the sabotage, or the systematic undermining of my achievements and relationships. That evening, I shared Amanda's insights with James, who listened with the focused attention he gave to intelligence briefings that revealed enemy strategy and capabilities. She's been running a decades-long campaign to neutralize you as competition while positioning herself as the family's primary investment priority, he said when I finished recounting Amanda's examples. And your parents have been willing participants because managing her emotional volatility is easier than holding her accountable for harmful behavior. So what do I do with this information? I asked. How do I proceed knowing that my entire family has been gaslighting me for my whole life? James was quiet for several minutes, considering the strategic implications of what we'd uncovered. Finally, he said, "You have two choices. You can continue participating in a system that requires you to doubt your own perceptions and absorb abuse to maintain family relationships. Or you can establish boundaries based on reality rather than their preferred narrative." What would boundaries look like? They would start with refusing to accept responsibility for other people's emotional reactions to your legitimate needs and concerns, James said. And they would include consequences for people who try to manipulate you into doubting your own experiences. As I sat in our small living room, surrounded by evidence of decades of emotional manipulation, I realized that the pregnancy attack hadn't been an isolated incident. It had been the culmination of a lifelong pattern of abuse that I'd been trained to accept as normal family dynamics. The question now was whether I had the courage to break free from a system that had shaped my entire identity, even if it meant losing the family relationships that had defined my sense of belonging for 31 years. For the first time in my life, I was beginning to understand the difference between love and control, between family loyalty and self-betrayal, between peace and the absence of conflict. The war wasn't just about defending my pregnancy from Natasha's attack. It was about claiming the right to trust my own perceptions and live according to my own values, regardless of how much that threatened the family system that had kept me in psychological bondage since childhood. The escalation began with a certified letter that arrived exactly 1 week after Thanksgiving. James was at base for an early morning briefing when the postal carrier knocked, and I signed for the thick envelope with trembling hands, already knowing that whatever it contained would change everything. The letterhead belonged to Whitmore and Associates, a prestigious law firm in Manhattan that I recognized from Natasha's social media posts about her business dealings. The letter was addressed to both James and me, but the language was clearly designed to intimidate rather than inform. Our client, Ms. Natasha Carmichael, has retained our services regarding defamatory statements and threats made against her person and professional reputation during a private family gathering on November 28th, the letter began. We are writing to inform you that any distribution, publication, or use of recorded conversations from that date without Ms. Carmichael's explicit consent constitutes a violation of privacy laws and may result in both civil and criminal charges. I read the paragraph 3 times before the full implications sank in. Natasha had hired attorneys to prevent James from sharing the recording of her attack on my pregnancy. She wasn't concerned about apologizing or repairing family relationships. She was worried about protecting her brand from the consequences of her own words. The letter continued with increasingly aggressive language. Furthermore, any continued harassment, intimidation, or attempts to damage Ms. Carmichael's professional relationships will be met with appropriate legal action. Our client has built a successful business based on her reputation for promoting positive family values and emotional wellness. Attempts to undermine that reputation through selective editing or misrepresentation of private family conversations will not be tolerated. The phrase selective editing was particularly galling. There was no editing involved. Natasha's words had been captured in their full, unvarnished cruelty. The suggestion that context might somehow make her attack on my pregnancy acceptable revealed how disconnected she was from the reality of what she'd said. The letter concluded with a demand that James and I sign a non-disclosure agreement acknowledging that no assault, harassment, or inappropriate behavior had occurred during the Thanksgiving gathering, and that any claims to the contrary were based on misunderstandings that had been resolved through family communication. I was still staring at the legal document when James returned home, his expression shifting to high alert when he saw my face and the papers scattered across our kitchen table. "They're trying to legally silence us," I said, handing him the letter. "Natasha hired attorneys to prevent you from sharing the recording, and to force us to sign a statement saying nothing inappropriate happened." James read through the document with the methodical attention he brought to analyzing enemy intelligence, his jaw tightening with each paragraph. When he finished, he set the papers down and reached for his phone. "I'm calling Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen," he said. "She's the base legal officer, and she specializes in civilian threats against military personnel. This crosses the line from family drama into potential security issues." The conversation with Lieutenant Commander Chen was enlightening and disturbing. After reviewing the letter and listening to portions of the Thanksgiving recording, she explained that Natasha's legal strategy revealed several concerning elements. "First," Chen said during our meeting at the base legal office, "the timing and aggressiveness of this response suggests your sister-in-law views the recording as genuinely threatening to her business interests. People don't hire Manhattan law firms for minor family disputes." Second, the demand for a retroactive non-disclosure agreement is highly unusual in family conflict situations. This suggests there may be other incidents or patterns of behavior that she is concerned about being exposed. Third, Chen continued, the letter's emphasis on protecting her, quote, professional reputation and, quote, business relationships indicates that her brand depends heavily on maintaining a specific public image that would be damaged by evidence of how she actually treats family members. Chen's analysis confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. Natasha wasn't just worried about one recording from Thanksgiving dinner. She was terrified that her years of manipulative and cruel behavior toward family members might become public knowledge and destroy the carefully crafted persona that generated her income. "What are our options?" James asked. "Legally, you're in a very strong position," Chen replied. The recording was made in a private home during a family gathering where all parties were aware that recording devices were present. Your sister-in-law has no reasonable expectation of privacy for statements made in that context. More importantly, truth is an absolute defense against defamation claims. If she actually said what's on that recording, then sharing it can't be defamatory regardless of how it affects her business. Chen recommended that we respond through military legal channels rather than hiring civilian attorneys, both to demonstrate that we had institutional support and to ensure that Natasha's legal team understood they were dealing with someone who couldn't be easily intimidated. The response letter that Chen drafted was a masterpiece of legal precision. It acknowledged receipt of Natasha's demands while making it clear that we would not be signing any non-disclosure agreements or admitting that her behavior had been acceptable. Our clients categorically reject the characterization of Ms. Carmichael's statements as private family conversations subject to confidentiality protections, the response read. Verbal attacks on pregnant women that include calling their pregnancies pathetic and accusing them of ruining the family bloodline constitute harassment regardless of familial relationships. The letter also put Natasha's attorneys on notice that any continued legal threats would be met with counterclaims for intentional infliction of emotional distress, and that the military took seriously any attempts to intimidate service members' families. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Within 24 hours, I received panicked phone calls from both Catherine and Harrison, who had apparently been contacted by Natasha's attorneys and informed about the military's involvement in what they'd assumed was a simple family disagreement. "Rebecca, what have you done?" Catherine's voice was high with anxiety. Natasha's lawyers are saying that James is threatening legal action and that the military is involved. This is getting completely out of hand. Mom, Natasha hired attorneys to try to silence us, I replied calmly. All we did was respond through appropriate legal channels. But why does the military need to be involved in a family matter? Because Natasha made it a legal matter when she hired lawyers to threaten my husband's career and our family's reputation, I explained. The military doesn't take kindly to civilians using intimidation tactics against service members. Harrison's call was more strategic, focusing on the potential consequences for everyone involved if the situation continued to escalate. Rebecca, I need you to understand what's at stake here, he said in his businessman voice. If this goes public, it could damage all of our reputations. Natasha's business, my investment firm, your mother's volunteer work, everything could be affected by negative publicity. Dad, the only person who's created any risk of negative publicity is Natasha, by saying things that would damage her reputation if they became public. But that's exactly my point, Harrison continued. If you and James pursue this legal route, everything becomes public record. Court documents, depositions, media coverage, it all becomes searchable online forever. The conversation revealed how little my father understood about accountability and consequences. In his worldview, the problem wasn't Natasha's behavior. It was the possibility that her behavior might become known to people outside the family. What would you like us to do? I asked. Pretend she didn't attack my pregnancy? Sign a legal document claiming that calling a pregnant woman's baby pathetic is normal family communication? I'd like you to consider the bigger picture, Harrison replied. This family has weathered difficult times before. We've always found ways to work through our differences without involving outsiders or creating permanent damage. But the biggest revelation came from an unexpected source. That evening, I received a call from Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a family therapist in Willowbrook Heights, who had apparently been contacted by Catherine about providing mediation services for our family communication issues. Mrs. Mitchell, Dr. Walsh said, I want you to know that I declined to work with your family after your mother described the situation she wanted me to address. What do you mean? Your mother called requesting family therapy to help resolve what she described as a misunderstanding between sisters that had been blown out of proportion by an overly protective husband, Dr. Walsh explained. But when I asked for specific details about the incident that triggered the conflict, her description of your sister's behavior raised serious red flags. Dr. Walsh continued, calling a pregnant woman's pregnancy pathetic and accusing her of ruining the family bloodline isn't a communication issue that can be resolved through mediation. It's verbal abuse, and the fact that your family is characterizing it as a misunderstanding suggests they don't understand the severity of what occurred. The therapist's professional assessment provided another crucial piece of external validation. Someone with expertise in family dynamics and abuse patterns had immediately recognized that what happened at Thanksgiving crossed the line from normal conflict into genuinely harmful behavior. I wanted to call you directly because I was concerned about the pressure you might be facing to participate in family therapy that would treat abusive behavior as a communication problem, Dr. Walsh said. No legitimate therapist would ask a pregnant woman to negotiate with someone who had verbally attacked her pregnancy. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Natasha's legal threats had actually backfired in a spectacular way. Instead of silencing us, they had involved military legal professionals who now had documentation of her behavior. Instead of keeping the situation private, they had prompted my parents to seek outside help from professionals who immediately recognized the abuse patterns. Most importantly, the legal escalation had forced everyone involved to choose sides in a way that revealed their true priorities. Natasha had chosen protecting her business over apologizing to her pregnant sister. My parents had chosen supporting Natasha's legal strategy over acknowledging the harm done to me. James and I had chosen truth and accountability over family peace. The battle lines were now clearly drawn, and for the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt confident about which side had the stronger position. The unraveling began when Natasha made the catastrophic decision to take our conflict public. 3 days after her legal threats had been rebuffed by military attorneys, she published a blog post titled, "When Family Boundaries Are Crossed, Protecting Yourself from Toxic Relatives." I discovered the post through a text from Amanda, who had been monitoring Natasha's social media presence since our conversation about family patterns. "Rebecca, you need to see this immediately," Amanda wrote, along with a link that would change everything. The blog post was a masterclass in manipulation disguised as vulnerability. Natasha had crafted a narrative where she was the victim of an abusive brother-in-law who had threatened her career because she'd expressed legitimate concerns about her sister's life choices during a family gathering. "Sometimes the people we love most make decisions that worry us," the post began. "As someone who values honest communication and family accountability, I believe we have an obligation to speak truth to the people we care about, even when that truth is difficult to hear." She went on to describe a fictional version of Thanksgiving dinner where she had gently raised questions about financial planning and career stability out of love and concern for her sister's well-being. "According to her narrative, I had become irrationally emotional, and my husband had threatened to destroy my business because we couldn't handle constructive feedback. The experience taught me that some people prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths," she wrote. "When you're committed to excellence and growth, you sometimes have to accept that not everyone in your life is ready for that level of authenticity and accountability." The post was accompanied by carefully selected photos from our childhood that portrayed her as a loving, supportive older sister who had always looked out for me. She'd even included a recent photo of herself holding a baby, not Lucas but the child of one of her friends, with a caption about the joy of being an aunt and her excitement about new additions to our family. The comments section was filled with supportive messages from her followers, praising her courage in setting boundaries with toxic family members and encouraging her to protect herself from people who couldn't appreciate her honesty and success. "You deserve family members who celebrate your achievements instead of trying to tear you down," one commenter wrote. "It's so hard when jealous relatives try to sabotage your success. Stay strong. Some people can't handle being around excellence. Their loss." The blog post had been shared hundreds of times within hours of publication, and several of Natasha's brand partners had commented with supportive messages about standing up to family toxicity and maintaining professional boundaries. James read the post with the controlled fury I'd learned to recognize when he encountered deliberate dishonesty in high-stakes situations. "She's not just lying about what happened," he said grimly. "She's using our private family crisis to generate content and sympathy from her audience." But the most disturbing element was buried in the middle of the post where Natasha had written, "I've learned that you can't help people who don't want to be helped. Some family members will choose to remain stuck in patterns of mediocrity and blame others for their life circumstances, rather than taking responsibility for their choices." She was using our conflict to reinforce her brand messaging about personal excellence and the importance of surrounding yourself with people who supported your success. My pregnancy, my marriage, and our family crisis had all become raw material for her content creation and audience engagement. I was still processing the blog post when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something compelled me to answer. "Is this Rebecca Mitchell?" a woman's voice asked. "Yes, who is this?" "My name is Dr. Lisa Rodriguez. I'm a clinical psychologist who specializes in family trauma and narcissistic abuse patterns. I came across your sister's blog post, and I'm calling because I'm concerned about what I'm seeing." Dr. Rodriguez explained that she had been following Natasha's content for several months as part of research she was conducting on social media influencers who promoted toxic positivity and family dynamics that could be harmful to vulnerable audiences. "Your sister's blog post contains several red flags that suggest she may be publicly misrepresenting a situation where she was actually the aggressor," Dr. Rodriguez said. "The language patterns, the victim positioning, the way she's using family conflict to generate audience sympathy, These are classic techniques used by people with narcissistic tendencies to maintain public image while avoiding accountability. The conversation that followed was both validating and terrifying. Dr. Rodriguez had identified specific phrases and narrative techniques in Natasha's post that were consistent with what she called public gaslighting, the practice of using social media platforms to spread alternative versions of events designed to discredit victims and gain public support for abusive behavior. What concerns me most, Dr. Rodriguez continued, is that she's not just defending herself. She's actively attacking your credibility and your husband's character while positioning herself as a victim of your family's toxicity. This suggests someone who is escalating rather than de-escalating conflict. Dr. Rodriguez also pointed out something I had missed. Natasha's post contained subtle threats disguised as boundary-setting language. Phrases like protecting myself from people who can't handle truth and choosing not to participate in toxic family dynamics were actually warnings to her audience that anyone who challenged her narrative would be labeled as toxic and potentially exposed to public criticism. She's essentially crowdsourcing support for a war against your family, Dr. Rodriguez explained. Her followers are now invested in your sister's victim narrative, which means any evidence that contradicts that narrative will be met with defensive hostility from people who have never met you but feel personally connected to her success. The implications were staggering. Natasha hadn't just published a misleading account of our conflict. She had weaponized her entire audience against us by making them emotionally invested in believing that we were the toxic family members who were trying to destroy her because we couldn't handle her success and honesty. That evening, James and I sat down to develop a strategic response. The military legal team had advised us that Natasha's blog post actually strengthened our position by demonstrating her pattern of public manipulation and dishonesty, but we needed to be careful about how we proceeded. She's made a critical error, James observed. By taking this public, she's opened herself up to public scrutiny of her claims. And by characterizing our family conflict as an example of toxic relatives trying to sabotage success, she's invited people to examine whether her version of events is actually true. The next morning brought an unexpected ally. I received a call from Marcus Chen, one of Natasha's former business partners, who had ended their collaboration 6 months earlier under circumstances that had never been fully explained publicly. "Rebecca, I saw your sister's blog post and I think you should know that this isn't the first time she's used family conflicts to generate content and audience sympathy," Marcus said. "She's done this before, and there are other people who have had similar experiences with her." Marcus explained that he had ended his business relationship with Natasha after discovering that she had been sharing private information about his family situation with her audience without his consent. When he had confronted her about the violation of privacy, she had publicly characterized him as a, quote, toxic business partner who couldn't handle her success and authenticity. She has a pattern of creating conflicts with people close to her, then using those conflicts to reinforce her brand messaging about surrounding yourself with excellence and cutting out toxic influences, Marcus continued. It's actually quite sophisticated. She generates drama that she can then resolve publicly in ways that make her look like a victim who's growing stronger through adversity. Marcus also revealed that several other former friends and business associates had similar experiences with Natasha, but had been reluctant to speak publicly because of her large following and ability to mobilize her audience against critics. "What you're experiencing isn't just family dysfunction," Marcus said. "It's a deliberate strategy she uses to maintain her public image while treating the people closest to her badly. And now she's made the mistake of targeting someone whose husband has the resources and authority to fight back effectively." By the end of the week, I had connected with 3 other people who had been publicly mischaracterized by Natasha after private conflicts. Each story followed the same pattern. Genuine concerns or boundaries were met with escalation, then reframed as examples of toxic behavior that Natasha had courageously overcome through personal growth and boundary setting. The evidence was overwhelming. What had happened to me at Thanksgiving wasn't an isolated incident triggered by stress or poor communication. It was the latest example of a systematic pattern of behavior where Natasha created drama with people close to her, then used that drama to generate content and audience engagement while positioning herself as the victim of other people's toxicity. Armed with this information and the support of multiple witnesses to her pattern of behavior, James and I were ready to respond to her public attack in a way that would expose the truth about her character and business practices. The war she had started by attacking my pregnancy was about to become a reckoning for years of manipulation, exploitation, and abuse disguised as family dynamics and authentic sharing. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt like we had the resources and allies necessary to not just defend ourselves, but to ensure that other people would be protected from similar treatment in the future. The collapse of Natasha's carefully constructed world began with a single email that arrived in my inbox 2 weeks after her blog post went viral. The sender was someone I'd never heard of, Elena Vasquez, executive producer at Lifestyle Network Studios. Mrs. Mitchell, the email began, I hope you'll forgive this unsolicited contact, but I felt compelled to reach out after becoming aware of recent events involving your family. I work in television production, and we had been in preliminary discussions with your sister about a potential reality show concept centered around her family content. My stomach dropped as I continued reading. Natasha hadn't just been creating social media content about our family. She had been pitching us as characters in a television show without our knowledge or consent. We were initially impressed by Ms. Carmichael's presentation about authentic family dynamics and multi-generational relationships, Elena continued. However, recent developments have raised serious concerns about the accuracy of her representations and the ethical implications of building entertainment content around family members who may not have consented to participation. Elena requested a phone call to discuss what she diplomatically termed discrepancies between Ms. Carmichael's public narratives and information we've received from other sources. When we spoke that afternoon, she revealed the stunning scope of Natasha's deception. Your sister pitched our network on a show called Building Legacy, which was supposed to document how successful families maintain relationships across different career paths and life choices, Elena explained. She presented herself as someone who had successfully balanced high achievement with close family bonds, particularly emphasizing her relationship with her military family members. The irony was breathtaking. Natasha had been using our marriage and James's military service as selling points for a television show, while simultaneously attacking both in private family interactions. She showed us carefully edited social media content that portrayed warm relationships, holiday celebrations, and supportive family dynamics, Elena continued. But when we began our standard background research and reference checks, we discovered some concerning inconsistencies. Elena's team had spoken with Marcus Chen and other former business associates, uncovering the pattern of manufactured conflicts that Natasha used for content creation. More damaging still, they had found inconsistencies in her representations of family relationships when they cross-referenced her public content with actual family members' social media presence. Frankly, Mrs. Mitchell, your sister appears to have been presenting fictional family relationships as documentary content. That's not just ethically problematic, it's potentially fraudulent if she was seeking compensation based on those misrepresentations. The television deal that Natasha had been counting on was dead, killed by her own pattern of dishonesty and manipulation. But Elena's research had uncovered something even more damaging. Evidence that Natasha had been misrepresenting family relationships for years, building her entire brand on fictional narratives about people who had never agreed to be part of her public persona. I'm calling you directly because our legal team advised us to document that we attempted to verify information with actual family members before making any final decisions about the project, Elena said. But I'm also calling because, as someone who works in this industry, I wanted you to know that your sister has been using your family as unpaid actors in a performance that was generating significant income for her personally. That same day brought another revelation through Amanda, who had been systematically investigating Natasha's business practices since the Thanksgiving incident. She discovered that several of Natasha's brand partnerships were built on false claims about family endorsements and lifestyle authenticity. "Rebecca, I think you need to see this," Amanda said, sending me screenshots of sponsored posts where Natasha had claimed that her military family members used and recommended specific products. She'd been earning commission on sales generated by implying that James and I had tested and approved everything from meal planning services to financial planning apps. "She's been monetizing your identities without your permission," Amanda explained. "Some of these partnerships explicitly required her to disclose family member endorsements, which means she's been lying to brands about having your approval for sponsored content." The evidence Amanda had compiled was damning. Natasha had built significant portions of her income stream on fictional family relationships and unauthorized endorsements. Her followers believed they were supporting someone who had authentic, loving family connections, when in reality she had been systematically damaging those relationships while profiting from their supposed existence. James's reaction to these revelations was swift and decisive. Within hours, he had contacted Lieutenant Commander Chen with documentation of Natasha's unauthorized use of his military status and family identity for commercial purposes. "This crosses the line from family conflict into identity theft and potential fraud," Chen explained during our emergency meeting. "Using a service member's identity for commercial gain without consent is a federal issue, especially when false endorsements are involved." The military legal team immediately issued cease and desist orders to Natasha and her business partners, demanding removal of all content that referenced James or our family without explicit permission. They also initiated contact with the Federal Trade Commission regarding the undisclosed sponsored content and false family endorsements. But the most devastating blow came from an unexpected source: Natasha's own audience. Dr. Rodriguez, the psychologist who had initially contacted me about the blog post, had been conducting her own investigation into Natasha's content patterns. She had created a detailed analysis of inconsistencies in Natasha's family narratives over the past 2 years, comparing public claims with verifiable information. "I've documented at least 47 instances where your sister made claims about family interactions, endorsements, or relationships that cannot be substantiated and appear to be fictional," Dr. Rodriguez explained during a follow-up call. "This isn't just misleading content. It's systematic deception of her audience." Dr. Rodriguez had shared her analysis with several influencer accountability websites and consumer protection advocates who specialized in exposing fraudulent social media practices. The information was spreading through networks of people who tracked misleading content and false advertising in the influencer industry. The first public exposure came through a YouTube channel called Authentic Living Exposed, which specialized in investigating lifestyle influencers who built careers on false claims about their personal lives. Their video about Natasha was titled, "The Military Family That Never Endorsed Her: How Natasha Carmichael Built a Brand on Fictional Relationships." The video included interviews with Marcus Chen and other former associates, documentation of the unauthorized military endorsements, and analysis of the discrepancies between Natasha's public claims and her actual family relationships. Most damaging of all, it included audio excerpts from the Thanksgiving recording, obtained legally through James's military documentation of the incident, that revealed the stark contrast between her public persona and her private behavior toward family members. Within 48 hours, the video had generated over 200,000 views and thousands of comments from viewers expressing shock at the gap between Natasha's public image and her actual treatment of family members. Her brand partners began requesting clarification about the family endorsement claims, and several smaller sponsors immediately terminated their contracts. The comments section became a forum for former followers to share their own doubts about Natasha's authenticity, with many people noting inconsistencies they had observed but dismissed. The carefully maintained facade of loving family relationships and authentic lifestyle content was crumbling in real time as her audience realized they had been systematically deceived. "I always wondered why her sister never appeared in any content," one commenter wrote. "Now I understand why. Because she was creating fictional relationships while destroying her actual family connections." Catherine and Harrison's response to the public exposure was immediate panic. Both called within hours of the video's release, begging me to somehow contain the damage and protect Natasha from the consequences of her own actions. "Rebecca, you have to do something," Catherine pleaded through tears. "This is destroying her business. Her sponsors are dropping her. People are saying terrible things about our family online." "Mom, Natasha created this situation by lying about our family for years and attacking my pregnancy when I tried to set boundaries," I replied calmly. "The consequences she's facing are the natural result of her own choices." "But she's your sister," Catherine said, falling back on the manipulation that had worked for decades. "Family means protecting each other, even when we make mistakes." "Family means treating each other with basic respect," I countered. "Natasha chose to use our family as props for fictional content, then attacked my pregnancy when I refused to participate in her performance. These aren't mistakes. They're deliberate choices that hurt real people." Harrison's approach was more strategic, focusing on potential legal exposure for everyone involved if the situation continued to escalate publicly. "Rebecca, if this goes any further, we could all be facing lawsuits from her business partners for interfering with contracts," he warned. "The damage to the family reputation could affect all of our professional relationships." "Dad, the only person who damaged the family reputation is Natasha by building her career on lies about relationships she was actively destroying," I replied. "The truth isn't damaging to us. It's damaging to her because she built her success on deception." By the end of the week, Natasha had lost 6 major brand partnerships. Her reality show deal was officially dead, and her follower count had dropped by over 30,000 as people realized they had been supporting someone who had systematically deceived them about the most basic aspects of her personal life. The empire she had built on fictional family dynamics and unauthorized endorsements was collapsing under the weight of truth, and for the first time in her adult life, she was facing consequences that couldn't be managed through manipulation or family enablement. The war that had begun with her attack on my pregnancy had become a reckoning for decades of exploitation and deception that extended far beyond our family relationships. The transformation of my family's response to Natasha's behavior began with an unexpected phone call from my grandmother's sister, Eleanor Hartwell, who at 87 years old had remained largely outside our immediate family drama but had been quietly observing from her retirement community in Sarasota. "Rebecca, dear," Aunt Eleanor said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through enough family crises to recognize genuine dysfunction when she saw it. "I've been watching this situation unfold, and I think it's time someone in this family started telling the truth about what's been happening for the past 20 years. Eleanor had received calls from both Catherine and Harrison, asking her to intervene and convince me to stop destroying Natasha's life, but instead of accepting their version of events, she had done her own research into Natasha's public claims and business practices. "I spent 3 days going through that girl's social media accounts," Eleanor said, with the precision of someone who had run a successful accounting firm for 40 years before retirement. "She's been claiming that I endorsed products I've never heard of, describing holiday gatherings that never happened, and presenting relationships with family members that bear no resemblance to reality." Eleanor's investigation had revealed something that even I hadn't fully grasped. Natasha had been using our deceased grandmother Rose's memory as part of her brand narrative, creating fictional stories about Rose's wisdom and family values that supported whatever product or lifestyle concept Natasha was promoting at the time. She wrote an entire blog post about how Rose taught her that successful women invest in quality relationships and premium self-care products, Eleanor said, her voice heavy with disgust. "Your grandmother Rose would have been appalled by such materialistic nonsense. That woman saved every penny, darned her own stockings, and thought spending money on fancy cosmetics was the height of vanity." The revelation that Natasha had been exploiting our grandmother's memory for commercial purposes was the final straw for several extended family members who had been reluctant to take sides in what they'd viewed as a sister conflict. Cousins who had maintained polite neutrality began speaking up about their own experiences with Natasha's manipulative behavior over the years. My cousin David Hartwell, Eleanor's grandson, called that evening to share his own story about Natasha's pattern of exploitation. "Rebecca, I should have said something years ago, but I didn't want to cause family drama," he said. "Natasha has been using photos of my children in her content without permission, claiming they're examples of, quote, family bonding activities she organized during holiday visits." David explained that Natasha had never actually interacted meaningfully with his children during family gatherings, but had taken photos of them playing and used those images to create content about her role as a loving aunt who promoted healthy childhood development through quality family time. "My wife started noticing that our kids' faces were showing up in sponsored posts for children's products we've never used," David continued. "When I confronted Natasha about it, she said that family photos were community property and that I was being selfish for not supporting her business success." The conversation with David opened floodgates of similar revelations from other family members. Cousin after cousin contacted me with stories of unauthorized use of their images, false claims about endorsements, and fictional narratives about family relationships that served Natasha's business interests while having no basis in reality. Most disturbing was the revelation from my cousin Sarah Martinez, who had discovered that Natasha had been using her military husband's deployment story as content for Memorial Day and Veterans Day posts, claiming that her close relationship with military families gave her special insight into the challenges of service member life. "She's never had a meaningful conversation with my husband about his deployment experiences," Sarah said angrily. "But she's been earning money from sponsored posts where she claims to understand military family struggles because of her quote, intimate knowledge of deployment challenges through family connections." The systematic nature of Natasha's exploitation was becoming clear. She had built her entire brand by stealing authentic experiences from family members, repackaging them as her own insights, and monetizing relationships that existed only in her carefully crafted social media narrative. Catherine's response to these revelations marked the beginning of her own painful awakening to the reality of her eldest daughter's character. When confronted with documentation of Natasha's unauthorized use of family photos and false claims about deceased relatives, Catherine could no longer maintain her position that Natasha was simply misunderstood. "I had no idea," Catherine whispered during a tearful phone call. "I thought she was just sharing family moments on social media. I didn't realize she was making money from our private lives without telling us." The conversation with Catherine was heartbreaking, but necessary. For the first time in my adult life, my mother was seeing Natasha's behavior clearly, without the filtering lens of maternal protection and enabling that had obscured the truth for decades. "She told me that successful influencers shared authentic family content," Catherine continued. "I thought I was supporting her career by allowing her to include family photos and stories. I never imagined she was creating fictional relationships and false endorsements." Catherine's awakening accelerated when she received a call from one of Natasha's former brand partners, demanding clarification about whether Catherine had actually endorsed a luxury skincare line that Natasha claimed her mother had been using for years with incredible results. "I've never used those products," Catherine told me, her voice filled with confusion and betrayal. "I don't even know what they are." But Natasha posted photos of me at family gatherings, with captions claiming that I swore by this company's anti-aging routine. The brand partner informed Catherine that Natasha had been receiving significant commission payments based on sales generated by these false family endorsements, and that the company was considering legal action for fraudulent advertising practices. Harrison's recognition of the scope of Natasha's deception took longer, but was ultimately more devastating when it came. As someone who had built his career on financial integrity and ethical business practices, discovering that his daughter had been engaged in systematic fraud shattered his ability to continue defending her behavior. The breaking point came when Harrison received a call from his own business partner, who had seen some of Natasha's content, where she claimed that her father's investment firm had achieved success through principles she had learned and was now teaching through her lifestyle brand. "Rebecca, she's been using my company's reputation to lend credibility to her business advice," Harrison said, his voice hollow with shock. "She's been telling people that she learned investment strategies from me that she's never actually learned. And she's been implying that my business success validates her lifestyle coaching credentials." The revelation forced Harrison to confront the possibility that Natasha's false claims about his business could expose his firm to liability issues if clients made investment decisions based on her unauthorized representations of his strategies and philosophies. "I've spent 30 years building a reputation based on honesty and transparency," Harrison said quietly. "I can't allow that to be compromised by someone who's willing to lie about family relationships for personal gain." The most powerful transformation came from an unexpected alliance between Catherine and Eleanor, who began working together to document the extent of Natasha's exploitation of family relationships and memories. Their investigation revealed years of false claims, unauthorized endorsements, and fictional narratives that had generated substantial income while damaging real family relationships. "We enabled this," Catherine admitted during a three-way call with Eleanor and me. "We thought we were supporting her success, but we were actually allowing her to exploit our entire family for commercial purposes." Eleanor's response was characteristically direct. "Catherine, that girl has been running a con game on all of us for years. She convinced us that supporting her meant letting her do whatever she wanted with our relationships and our reputations. It's time we stopped being marks in her scheme." The unified family response that emerged from these revelations was unprecedented in my experience. For the first time in decades, family members were prioritizing truth and accountability over protecting Natasha from the consequences of her choices. A family meeting was scheduled not to pressure me into reconciliation, but to address the systematic exploitation that had been occurring under the guise of supporting Natasha's career. The meeting would include documentation of false claims, unauthorized endorsements, and fictional narratives that had generated income at the expense of family relationships and individual reputations. "We're not doing this to punish her," Eleanor explained. "We're doing this to protect ourselves and to ensure that she understands there are consequences for treating family members as unpaid actors in her commercial performance." The family that had spent decades enabling Natasha's manipulation was finally ready to hold her accountable for behavior that had crossed the line from self-centered to genuinely fraudulent. The reckoning that was coming wouldn't just address her attack on my pregnancy, it would confront years of exploitation that had damaged relationships, violated trust, and built financial success on a foundation of systematic deception. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt like I had genuine family support for establishing boundaries based on truth, rather than managing Natasha's emotional reactions to accountability. 6 months later, I stood in the nursery James had painted a soft sage green, watching our daughter Emma sleep peacefully in the crib that had belonged to his grandmother. At 4 months old, she was everything we had dreamed of during those difficult early pregnancy days. Healthy, curious, and surrounded by people who genuinely celebrated her existence. The room was filled with gifts from our chosen family at Naval Station Norfolk, handmade blankets from military spouses who had become true sisters, and photos from the baby shower that Colonel Hendricks had organized in the base community center. Every item represented authentic love and support from people who had proven their commitment to our family through actions rather than words. James found me there, as he often did during Emma's afternoon naps, both of us still marveling at the miracle of her presence in our lives. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly, though his tone suggested he already knew my answer. "None," I replied, watching Emma's tiny chest rise and fall with the steady rhythm of perfect contentment. "Look at her, James. She's surrounded by people who chose to love her unconditionally, who celebrate her milestones without agenda, who protect her without being asked." The contrast with my birth family's response to Emma's arrival had been stark and clarifying. Natasha had not contacted us at all during my pregnancy or after Emma's birth. Catherine and Harrison had sent a generic baby gift purchased online, accompanied by a card signed simply "Grandparents," as if acknowledging their relationship to Emma while maintaining emotional distance from the circumstances of their estrangement from us. The family meeting that Eleanor had organized had taken place in February, 3 months before Emma's birth. It had been a reckoning years in the making, with documentation of Natasha's systematic exploitation presented by family members who had finally found the courage to speak truth about her behavior. Natasha had attended the meeting with a new attorney, having apparently learned from her previous legal missteps that family conflicts required more sophisticated damage control than cease and desist letters. Her strategy had been to position herself as the victim of a coordinated family conspiracy designed to destroy her career out of jealousy and resentment. "I've worked harder than anyone in this family to build something meaningful," she had said, her voice carrying the same self-righteous tone she used in her most offensive blog posts. "Instead of celebrating my success, you're all trying to tear me down because you can't stand that I've achieved more than you thought possible." But the documentation assembled by Eleanor and Catherine was comprehensive and undeniable. Bank records showing commission payments from false family endorsements, screenshots of sponsored posts claiming product recommendations from relatives who had never used those products, email threads where brand partners explicitly asked for family member verification that Natasha had provided through fictional testimonials. "This isn't about your success," Eleanor had said with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades managing complex financial situations. "This is about the fact that you built that success by lying about relationships with people who never consented to be part of your business model." The meeting had concluded with clear boundaries established by unanimous family consensus. Natasha would remove all content that referenced family members without explicit written permission. She would cease using family photos, stories, or relationships in any commercial context. She would publicly acknowledge that previous claims about family endorsements had been inaccurate and apologize for any misleading representations. In exchange, family members would not pursue legal action for the unauthorized use of their identities and would maintain privacy about the full extent of her deceptive practices. Natasha had rejected the terms entirely, declaring that her family was trying to control her business out of spite and that she would rebuild her brand without any of us. She had left the meeting threatening legal action against anyone who continued to, quote, interfere with her livelihood through defamatory statements. The threats had proven empty. Her remaining brand partners had terminated contracts after learning about the false family endorsement claims. Her follower count had continued to decline as her audience recognized the gap between her promoted authentic family values and her actual treatment of family relationships. The lifestyle coaching business that had been built on fictional family dynamics had collapsed when the fiction was exposed. According to Amanda, who still monitored Natasha's online presence, she had moved to Los Angeles and was attempting to reinvent herself as a wellness coach focused on recovery from toxic family systems. The irony was perfect. She was now building content around being the victim of the same family dysfunction she had created and perpetuated for years. "She's claiming that cutting contact with us was the best decision she ever made for her mental health," Amanda had reported during our last conversation. "Her new brand is all about empowering people to leave behind family members who don't support their growth and success." The transformation in Catherine and Harrison had been profound and ongoing. Both had entered family therapy to understand how they had enabled Natasha's behavior for so long and to learn healthier patterns for future relationships. Catherine's work with a therapist who specialized in narcissistic family dynamics had been particularly revelatory. "I spent so many years thinking that protecting Natasha from consequences was the same thing as loving her," Catherine had explained during one of our recent conversations. "I realize now that I was actually enabling her to hurt people by refusing to hold her accountable for her choices." Catherine's relationship with Emma had been cautious but genuine. She visited monthly, always respectful of our boundaries and careful not to impose expectations or obligations. The grandmother role she was building with Emma was based on earning trust rather than demanding access, and the difference in her behavior was remarkable. "I want to be the kind of grandmother who actually protects Emma," Catherine had said during her most recent visit, watching Emma play with blocks on our living room floor, "not someone who teaches her that family relationships mean accepting harmful treatment from people who claim to love you." Harrison's transformation had been quieter but equally significant. He had begun including James in genuine conversations about military service and leadership, asking thoughtful questions about naval operations and command responsibilities. The respect he now showed for James's career was authentic rather than performative, based on understanding rather than obligation. "I spent years dismissing James's achievements because they didn't fit my definition of success," Harrison had admitted. "I'm learning that there are many ways to build a meaningful life, and that integrity matters more than income." The military community that had supported us through the crisis had become Emma's extended family in ways that felt natural and sustainable. Colonel Hendricks had become an honorary grandmother, bringing homemade cookies and offering babysitting services with genuine enthusiasm. Lieutenant Commander Chen had organized a legal fund for military families facing civilian harassment, using our experience as a case study for protective strategies. Most importantly, Emma was growing up in an environment where love was demonstrated through consistent actions, rather than demanded through emotional manipulation. She would learn that healthy relationships required mutual respect, that boundaries were expressions of self-care rather than selfishness, and that family meant people who celebrated your happiness without requiring you to minimize your own needs. Dr. Rodriguez had published a case study about our situation in a professional journal, using it as an example of how social media platforms could be used to perpetuate family abuse patterns while maintaining public facades of positive relationships. The article had been shared widely among therapists and family advocates, helping other professionals recognize similar patterns in their clients' experiences. What you accomplished by refusing to accept the gaslighting and insisting on accountability has implications far beyond your individual family, Dr. Rodriguez had told me during our final consultation. "You demonstrated that even sophisticated manipulation campaigns can be defeated when victims have support and documentation." As I watched Emma sleep, surrounded by photos from her authentic baby shower and gifts from people who loved her for exactly who she was, I felt deep gratitude for the choice we had made to prioritize truth over harmony, protection over peace, and genuine relationships over obligatory ones. The war that had begun with Natasha's attack on my pregnancy had ended with something far more valuable than victory: the knowledge that we could build the kind of family that actually deserved the name. Emma would never know the dysfunction that had shaped my childhood, but she would grow up understanding that love meant consistency, safety, and respect. She would learn that family relationships were earned rather than inherited, and that her worth was never negotiable, regardless of who questioned it. The baby who Natasha had called pathetic was now sleeping peacefully in a home filled with authentic love, protected by boundaries that ensured her safety, surrounded by people who had chosen to celebrate her existence without condition or agenda. In losing my birth family, we had gained something infinitely more precious: the freedom to love without fear, to trust without reservation, and to build relationships based on choice rather than obligation. Emma stirred in her sleep, her tiny hand reaching toward the mobile of stars and moons that James had installed above her crib. In that simple gesture, I saw our future: a child reaching toward possibilities in a world where she would always be protected, always be valued, and always be free to become exactly who she was meant to be. The story that had begun with an attack on her very existence had become the foundation for a life built on truth, love, and the unshakable knowledge that she was wanted, celebrated, and cherished by everyone who truly mattered. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.